In this video, I'm deploying Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Hello everyone, this is Geraldos and I'm Travis. In this video, I'm going to walk through setting up Azure AD Domain Services. There's a lot of confusion about Microsoft's different Active Directory services. So if you're not sure what the difference is between Windows AD, Azure AD, or Azure AD Domain Services, take a look at my video for details. I'll post the link above. Before we get started, please take a second to subscribe and don't be afraid to click that like button if you enjoy these videos. It costs nothing and it really helps this channel a lot. Let's get into it. At a high level, Azure AD Directory Services is a Windows AD compatible PaaS offering in Azure. It facilitates applications that require Windows AD without the need to deploy a domain controller in Azure. Identities are sourced from Azure AD. That includes identities that are synchronized from Windows AD to Azure AD with Azure AD Connect. It has some limitations compared to Windows AD. The schema cannot be extended, user domains cannot be federated, and LDAP is read-only. In this video, I'm going to add Azure AD Domain Services to my existing tenant. This Azure AD tenant has a mix of cloud-only identities and identities sourced from Windows AD. Identities in Windows AD replicate to Azure AD, and identities in Azure AD, including those sourced from Windows AD, synchronize to Azure AD Domain Services. Windows AD is not a requirement for Azure AD Domain Services. Without Windows AD, Azure AD is the only source of the identities. Either way, Azure AD is the source for Azure AD Domain Services users and groups. Let's move on to how same sign-on works with identities sourced from Windows AD. Same sign-on means users can use the same credentials across multiple directories. This is important so users don't have to keep track of multiple usernames and passwords. Azure AD Domain Services relies on legacy password hash format that supports NTLM and Kerberos authentication to authenticate the users. The problem is, until you deploy Azure AD Domain Services, Azure AD does not store password hashes in a format that supports NTLM and Kerberos. Azure AD also doesn't store passwords in a way that would allow it to generate those password hashes. So by default, the identities don't have a password value to allow users to log into the Azure AD Domain Services. The only way to generate a valid password hash is to change the user password after deploying Azure AD Domain Services. That process creates the hash value needed for Azure AD Domain Services. Users will need to change the password or passwords can be set to expire, forcing a password change. Newly created accounts will also have the legacy password hash created. Either way, cloud identities won't be able to log into Azure AD Domain Services until their passwords have been updated. This includes the Azure AD Global Admin account that we're going to use to initially log into Azure AD Domain Services. Same sign-on is different in hybrid environments that source from Windows AD. Windows AD stores the password hash value, but by default, AD Connect does not synchronize that value to Azure AD. Keep in mind that this is a different hash value from the password hash synchronization used to support same sign-on with Azure AD. The hash synchronization triggered with that checkbox when deploying AD Connect. This is a different hash value. Authenticating users to Azure AD Domain Services requires synchronizing that legacy password hash value that supports NTLM and Kerberos. This is enabled with a PowerShell command ran after deploying Azure AD Domain Services. The script I use to enable legacy password hash synchronization is from Microsoft. I'll include the link below. All users and groups in Azure AD are synchronized to Azure AD Domain Services if using the default settings. Synchronization can be scoped to if there's a reason to limit the user and group synchronization. Scoped synchronization is scoped based on a selected group in Azure AD. Only users in that group will be synchronized to Azure AD Domain Services. If the default Synchronize All option is selected at deployment, the only option to change the scope is to remove and redeploy Azure AD Domain Services. If you scope to a group during deployment, you can change the scope later on if your needs for synchronization change. In the demo, I'm going to start out by creating a new VNet for Azure AD Domain Services. The DNS server on the VNet has to point to Azure AD Domain Service. My existing VNet already has a domain controller acting as the VNet's DNS server, so I'm deploying a new VNet so that doesn't interfere with what I have in place already. After that, I'll deploy Azure AD Domain Services, and then I'll deploy a server into that new VNet. Once that's done, I'll configure password hash synchronization for both Azure AD and Windows AD. Once that's finished, I should be able to join the server to the domain and log in with both a Windows ID and an Azure AD sourced user account. Let's get started.
Here I am at the Azure portal, and the first thing I'm going to do to get started is create the new VNet. So I'll go to Create Resource and type in VNet. And I'll create. I'll give it a name, and I'm just going to call this AADDS VNet. I'm going to change the address space to 10.201. I don't need to add IPv6 addresses. The subscription will stay the same. I'm going to create a new resource group, and I'm going to add all my Azure Active Directory domain service resources into the same resource group. This is fine for a demo, but you may want to consider best practices around naming for implementing this in production. This could be around for a while in production, and you want to make sure it's compliant with naming policies. I'll set my location, Central US in this instance. In the first subnet, I'll leave it named default. I have to change the address range though to match the address space. I'll leave DDoS protection as basic and leave the service endpoint and firewall as it is. And I'll click Create. Okay, the VNet has been created. Now let's go in and set up Azure Active Directory Domain Services. So again, I'll start by creating a resource and type in Active Directory Domain Services. Here it is. And click Create. So I'm going to select an existing resource group. And that's going to be the same one I created the VNet in. For the domain name, I'm already using Xeraltos.com for my Windows AD. So I'm going to add a subdomain of AADDS for Azure Active Directory Domain Services. I'll leave the location as it is, and I'm going to leave it as a forest type of user. Notice that there's a resource that's in preview. That does support trust relationships, but I'm sticking with user at this point. Next, I'll go on to networking. And I'm going to select the VNet we just created. I'm going to go into Manage Subnets. And I'll create a subnet specifically for Azure Active Directory Domain Services. And I can leave it as the 10.201.1 subnet. I'll leave everything else as is and click OK to create it. Now select the new subnet I just created. Notice the warning here that network security groups will automatically be created, so you'll want to let Azure Active Directory Domain Services manage those security groups. We'll move on to administration. So this AADDC administrators, that would be equivalent to a domain admin group. And here if we go into Manage Group Membership, here you can see the group membership. These two accounts were added by default because they're global admin. And this was from a previous attempt I did at installing Active Directory Domain Services. This is not a global admin, but it is an account I want to use for a domain join. So that was added in. So that looks good. You can add others to this group if you'd like them to be domain admins as well. So I'll just close out and go back. And here's where you can set up notifications. I'm going to leave that as is and go to synchronization. I'm going to leave it as synchronizing all, but you can change the scope if you'd like to. I'll go to review and create. That all looks good, and I'm going to create. Here it's warning me that the following choices are final and can't be changed, and that's okay, so I'm going to click OK. This can take up to an hour to finish, so I'm going to pause here and come back once it's done. So the deployment of Azure Active Directory Domain Services is finished. And here we can see it. Before I go into that, I want to just point out something. If I go into the VNet that I created and go into DNS settings, you can see it's set to default, which is the Azure provided DNS. So I'm going to go back and go into Active Directory Domain Services. And you can see it's running. It has the status of running. I believe after the deployment is finished, it will go into a state of syncing. The initial sync takes some time to finish. So you want to wait until that's done and it has a status of running before you continue on. The next item to take care of is to configure the DNS settings. So I do that by just going right here and click Configure. And what that will do is configure the DNS settings on the VNet to point to the new Active Directory Domain Servers DNS servers. We can go back and take a look at that right here. Go back into DNS. And now it's pointing at the 2 IP addresses of the Azure AD Domain Services. Okay, the next step is to create a server to put on that VNet that we're going to use to join the domain. So I'll go into Create Resources, go to Compute, and select Virtual Machine. I'll select the existing resource group. And in production, I wouldn't put all of this in the same resource group, but for the demo, that's fine. I'll give the VM a name. Change the region to the same region as the VNet I created. I'm going to select a different image. And I'll go to Windows Server 2019 Data Center. I'm going to make this a spot instance. I have a whole video on spot instances if you're interested in learning more. But basically, it's much cheaper, but Microsoft can shut it down in times of peak demand. I'm going to change the size. I want something with 2 CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM. Otherwise, testing can be a little sluggish if I go too small. So I'll select that. Now I'll enter in the username and password. I'll leave the ports as it is and click on Next to go to disks. Here I'll select a standard hard drive. Again, I don't need high performance with this. I'll go to network. Now, this is the important part. I have to change it to the VNet that I created. So I have 2 VNets. VNets by default don't communicate with each other. So I need to make sure I select the VNet that I deployed Azure Active Directory Domain Services to. And I'll select the default subnet. I'll leave public IP addresses as is. The rest can stay as is. I'll go into management. And I will auto shut down this. I'll select 10 p.m. And also change the time zone. And I do not need notifications. This setting could potentially save me some money if I step away from this demo for a few days and forget to shut this down. Click on Next, go to Advanced. Nothing in here. I'll leave tags as it is. And create. I'll pause here and come back once the virtual machine has been deployed. The deployment's finished. Now I'm going to go to the resource and sign in. Here I am at the virtual machine, and I'll just copy the IP address to the clipboard and log into that virtual machine. Next, I'm going to open up a command prompt and take a look at the IP configuration. So we can see here the IP address is on the 10.201 subnet. It ends in .4, so that's the first IP address available in that subnet. And down here you can see the DNS servers are set to 10.201.1.5 and 4. The 10.201.1 subnet is a subnet that we deployed Azure Active Directory Domain Services to. So that all makes sense, and we should be able to join the domain. Let's go in here and change. I'll change the domain to aadds.seraltos.com. Now it's asking for the credentials of an account that has rights to add servers to that domain. I'm going to enter the global admin account. And I'll enter the password. Okay, so that failed, and to be honest, that was expected. No, also, if you keep trying, you get 5 attempts in 2 minutes, and then it locks out for 30 minutes. Also, we have no way to manage the Azure Active Directory Domain Services domain. We don't have AD users and computers or anything to unlock an account. So if you do lock this account up, you'll just have to wait for 30 minutes. But why did this fail? It failed because Azure Active Directory Domain Services requires the legacy password hash for NTLM and Kerberos authentication. This account was sourced from Azure Active Directory, so it's a cloud-only account. Azure Active Directory does not have a copy of that legacy password hash, so it has nothing to sync to Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Because of that, Azure Active Directory Domain Services has an invalid password, or no password at all, so I'm not going to be able to log in with this. In order to get this to work, I have to go back into Azure Active Directory. From Azure Active Directory, I'm going to go into Users and find that user account. And reset the password. Now that Azure Active Directory Domain Service has been installed, anytime a user changes a password or a new user is created, that legacy password hash will be generated and synchronized with Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Now, unfortunately, the only way to force that to happen is to force everybody to change their password. That's something to take into consideration. You can't generate these without generating a new password. So here what I did is I opened up an in-private window and I went to portal.azure.com, logged in as that account, and it's forcing me to change that to new password. I'm just doing this so I don't have to deal with a temporary password. So I updated the password with my new password. Now I'm going to go back to the server and try again to join that server to the domain. Okay, that password's been changed. Let's give it another try. All right, there it is. So now I'm part of the domain. And I'm going to restart this and I'll be back when it finishes. Okay, I'm going to log into that computer again, and this time I'm logging in as my global admin account. So let's see if that works. And that worked. So I logged in with the global admin account, which is also I guess it'd be equivalent to a domain admin in the Azure Active Directory Domain Services domain. Now I'm going to add the Active Directory tools. I'm also going into remote desktop settings, and I'm going to add another group to allow connection to this. So this group is called WVD Profiles. That's for Windows Virtual Desktop. I'm not doing anything with Windows Virtual Desktop in this video or on this machine. It's just a group I have with a couple test users. And I'd like to point out that that group exists on my Windows Active Directory domain. So that group was replicated from Windows Active Directory to Azure Active Directory, and then from Azure Active Directory to Azure Active Directory Domain Services. So I'm going to add that. And while the tools are installing, I'm going to try to log in again with a user account that's in that group. Okay, so I got a credential did not work, which I expected. I expected that because by default, AD Connect does not replicate the legacy hashes for NTLM and Kerberos. So I have to force that manually. So I'm going to do that next. But before I go on to that, let's go look into Active Directory. I just want to point out, if I go into Active Directory users and computers and look at AADDC users here, these are all the users coming from Azure Active Directory. So those login VSIs, those are all accounts that I have set up on my Windows Active Directory domain. And if I go into the properties, you can see under account, the UPN is set to myseraltos.com and I can't change it. So once you have a computer joined to the Azure Active Directory domain, you can manage it pretty similarly to how you'd manage a Windows Active Directory domain, using the same tools. Okay, so at this point we've got a virtual machine joined to the domain, and we were able to log in with a global admin account that was sourced from Azure Active Directory. For the next step, we want to allow accounts that are sourced from Windows AD to log into that Azure Active Directory Domain Services domain. In order to do that, we have to allow those legacy password hashes for NTLM and Kerberos to replicate from Windows AD to Azure AD and then to Azure AD Domain Services. To do that, Microsoft has a script, and I'll leave a link to this page below. So what it does is it adds a force full password sync to AD Connect, and then the script will force a full password replication. So I'm going to hop over to the computer with AD Connect running, and I'm going to start running through these commands. So the first thing I need to do is open up AD Connect Sync and go to Connectors. And you can see I have two connectors here. The first one listed here is the Windows Azure Active Directory connector. And if I go in and do a properties, I can copy that name. Then I'll just cancel out. So that is for Windows Azure Active Directory. So here is where they want that. So I'll just paste that in. And then next it's asking for the AD connector. And I could type that in, but I just like to make sure I've got the exact same. And then I'll paste that in. So let me run this. And the module I need is installed on this computer because it has AD Connect running. And I've added this. I'm just going to get the connector. You'll notice here I have forceful password sync. I have that because I've already deployed Azure Active Directory Domain Services a couple times actually. So that's in there already, but I'm just going to step through this anyway. If you run this command after you go through this, you should see that forceful password sync as well. So this is going to create the configuration parameter and then update the connector. Now there's a slight chance this will error out on mine since I already have that. Nope. Let me just run this one again just to make sure it's still there. I don't see it in there, but I'm pretty sure it just ran off the screen since I removed it and recreated it. Actually here, the C value, $C, is assigned to the connector. So if I run that again, and then look at global parameters, and there it is. So the value is there. It just kind of trailed off from that previous screen. So the next step is to stop and start password synchronization. So let's run that. And now password synchronization has started. So at this point, all existing passwords, because Windows AD does have the NTLM and Kerberos legacy password hash. So this will kick off replication of that information from Windows AD to Azure Active Directory. From there, Azure Active Directory will then replicate that to Azure Active Directory Domain Services. So within a few minutes, maybe I'll give it a half an hour, we should be able to log into that machine with a user sourced from Windows AD. Okay, it's been about 5-10 minutes or so. I'm going to give it a try. So I'm connecting to the same machine. I'm going to change the name. This is an account that came from Windows Active Directory. Hey, and look at that. Let's just check out the IP address. Make sure I'm on the right computer. Yep, I'm still on that 10.201.0.4. I guess I could do host name as well. Yep, so that's the machine. So what I did here, let's see, after deploying Azure Active Directory Domain Services, I deployed a server, and then I changed the password on the global admin account, and I had to do that because Azure Active Directory does not have the NTLM or Kerberos legacy password hash. After you install Azure Active Directory Domain Services, Azure Active Directory will then start creating that, but it only creates it if a user changes their password or when a new user is created. After I changed that password, that replicated to Azure Active Directory Domain Services, and then I was able to add this server to the domain. And once it was added, I could log into the server as that global admin. Next, I ran the script on the server with AD Connect. That adds the forceful password sync parameter, and then I restarted a password sync on the AD connector. So with users sourced from Windows AD, you don't need to reset the password. You just have to create that password sync in order for that password hash to move over. I also added the Active Directory tools to the server, and we can use those tools to configure and manage Azure Active Directory Domain Services. That does it for the demo.
I hope you found this information useful. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Also remember that Azure AD Domain Services is not a free service, and you cannot shut it down when you're not using it to avoid charges. You will need to delete Azure AD Domain Services to stop those charges. Thanks for watching.